Today, we know professional wrestling as a massive industry. There are major events and powerful companies like Ring of Honor, New Japan Pro Wrestling, Total Non-Stop Action Wrestling, Lucha Libre AAA Worldwide, All Elite Wrestling, and of course the biggest of them all, WWE. In the past, we also knew World Championship Wrestling and Extreme Championship Wrestling. And if you're a fan of the territorial days, you probably know even more regional promotions and classic events. But have you ever wondered how all of this actually began? Because I was curious too, so I did a deep and honestly, sometimes dizzying research dive. There are so many points you can connect, and many records simply weren't well documented. But from what I found, we can trace the timeline backward. Simply put, it looks like this. Think of today as the modern corporate era, the era of global companies like the ones we just mentioned. Before this came the territorial era, largely coordinated under the National Wrestling Alliance. Before the territory system, there was the promoter cartel era. Before the cartel phase, major promoters largely operated independently. Before the age of large-scale promoters, there was the carnival era. Before the carnival period, what I call the transition and explosion era. And before that, at the very beginning, was the folk wrestling era. If we truly want to trace professional wrestling history, we can't just jump straight into the modern era. Professional wrestling was shaped through a very long journey, and that journey is incredibly fascinating. It developed through folk traditions, regional rivalries, and cross-continental cultural blending. And here is the key. The roots of folk wrestling were not in America. They were in the British Isles. So if we want to understand how professional wrestling was born in America, we first have to understand the folk wrestling traditions that grew in its homeland. Grab your coffee, and let's walk through history with me. In the British Isles, wrestling never existed as a single uniform form. Each region developed its own way of fighting. In the West Country, specifically Cornwall and Devon, two neighboring traditions emerged, bound by geography yet fueled by rivalry: Cornish wrestling and Devonshire wrestling. Both were often referred to as jacket wrestling. Wrestlers wore thick, loose jackets. All grips had to be taken on the jacket, not directly on the body. The objective was clear: throw your opponent so that he landed almost flat on his back in one clean throw. That was victory. No ground fighting. Everything had to be settled standing. The rules were nearly identical. But there was one crucial difference. In Cornwall, kicking was forbidden. In Devon, kicking was allowed. That small distinction was enough to fuel decades of rivalry. Moving north. In the Lake District, Cumberland and Westmoreland, and up into Scotland, the Backhold style developed. Here the match began with both wrestlers locking onto each other's bodies from the start, almost like a tight embrace. From that fixed position, each man searched for the opening that would allow him to throw the other. In Ireland, the emphasis was on collar and elbow control, a style that became known as collar and elbow. Meanwhile, in the industrial, mining and textile regions of East Lancashire, a much freer form of wrestling began to emerge. Within working-class communities, this style of wrestling became a popular form of entertainment and often a source of local betting. The style was known by several names, including Manchester style or Lancashire wrestle. Unlike the wrestling traditions found in other regions, this style placed almost no restrictions on grips. Wrestlers could seize any part of the body, and the contest was allowed to continue on the ground. At the time, this was the only wrestling tradition in Britain that openly permitted ground wrestling. Looking at all these differences, one common thread becomes clear. Wrestling has always been about two things: how you grip and how you throw. Each region had different rules, but the core remained the same, and without fully realizing it at the time, these folk traditions already contained a principle that would later become crucial: grip whatever you are allowed to grip, throw by whatever method is permitted. In that sense, the embryo of catch wrestling was already present within these early traditions. Since the Middle Ages, wrestling traditions in the British Isles were known to serve multiple purposes: as training for combat skills, as part of social and communal rituals, and as strength-based entertainment during public celebrations. In Celtic regions such as Cornwall and Devon, records from around the 13th to 15th centuries showed that wrestling matches were already being held regularly. Wrestling was important enough to attract the attention of the nobility. Some matches were even recorded as being witnessed by kings not only in England, but as far as France. However, acceptance was not always smooth. At certain periods, church authorities objected and attempted to ban the practice, considering it too rough or morally inappropriate. All of this reveals something important. At that time, wrestling was not merely a fighting technique. It had already become a social practice, a form of public entertainment that was debated, supported by some parts of society, and rejected by others. By the early 17th century, wrestling in the British Isles was no longer something new. It had become deeply rooted in everyday life. In 1602, Richard Carew wrote a book titled Survey of Cornwall. In it, Cornish wrestling was described as part of the region's identity. This shows that at the time, Cornish wrestling was not merely a pastime, but a symbol of local culture. It was socially established yet still far from becoming an industry. In Ireland, the situation was different. Historian Edward Maclesot noted that since the early 1600s, the rules of collar and elbow varied from region to region. Often the rules were only agreed upon moments before a match began. This means the practice was very much alive but not yet standardized. In northern England, references in positions by Richard Mulcaster indicate that wrestling had become a rural sport considered healthy and embedded in the customs of Cumbria. In Cumberland and Westmoreland, backhold wrestling developed informally practiced at village gatherings, seasonal fairs, and open pre-industrial fields. It served both as entertainment and as a test of physical ability for farmers, shepherds, and yeomen. In Scotland, wrestling also evolved in informal forms, influenced by Norse and Viking traditions. Matches were typically held at village markets and clan gatherings, without fixed written rules. Meanwhile, in East Lancashire, historical references can be traced back as far as the 14th century. In the town of Bolton, for example, records mention a form of wrestling that was far looser and more open than the styles practiced in other regions. This style developed as a mixture of local English traditions combined with the influence of continental immigrants, particularly from Germany, with the tradition of ringen, and from the Netherlands, with the style known as stoejen. From this cultural blend emerged a method of fighting that later became known as the Bolton method. Unlike the wrestling traditions of Cornwall or Devon, which had relatively strict grips and rules, this style allowed far greater freedom. Grips were not restricted. The contest could continue on the ground, and various forms of holds, locks, and physical pressure began to merge into a single style of combat. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the situation became even harsher. Waves of immigration caused by religious conflicts in Europe, combined with the social turmoil of the English Civil War in the 1640s, brought new influences to the way people fought. From this environment emerged a style known as Lancashire up-and-down fighting, often referred to as purring. This form of combat looked very different from the wrestling traditions of other regions. It combined wrestling with choking holds, hard kicks to the opponent's legs, and various forms of body control and restraint. Fighters often wore clogs, wooden, iron-studded shoes commonly used by miners and textile workers. As a result, these fights could become extremely brutal. Even so, one rule still remained. Striking with the hands was forbidden. At the time, up-and-down fighting was not always practiced as a sport. It was often used as a way to settle disputes between men in the village. A fight usually ended when one participant verbally surrendered or raised his hand as a sign of submission. The rules were minimal, and the violence was very real. All of this reveals something essential. Before it became spectacle, before it became business, and long before it became an industry, wrestling lived as a social practice embedded in the everyday life of English society. It varied from region to region, but one common truth remained clear: wrestling was part of the people's culture. As the 17th century began, A major historical shift was also taking place the era when the first English colonies landed in North America. This marked an early sign that wrestling traditions would eventually cross the Atlantic. However, in its earliest phase, wrestling in America was not yet widespread. It most likely survived within small immigrant communities, and historical records from that period remain limited and unclear. Meanwhile, when compared to other styles of the same period, Cornish wrestling appears to have been the most developed and best documented during the 17th century. In 1612 and 1627, the poet Michael Drayton mentioned Cornish wrestling in his works Polyolbion and the Battle of Agincourt. In these poems, he even recorded the names of specific throwing techniques and described the banners of two Cornish wrestlers, a strong indication that by the early 17th century, Cornish wrestling was already well known enough to enter national literature. Its popularity did not remain confined to the local level. In 1654, around 100 Cornish wrestlers were recorded competing in Hyde Park, London. The event was personally witnessed by Oliver Cromwell, one of England's most prominent military and political leaders. 15 years later, in 1669, a major tournament was held at St. James Park in London. This time, Charles II attended as a spectator, and the prize reached £1,000, an enormous sum for that era. All of this demonstrates that by the 17th century, Cornish wrestling was no longer merely a regional tradition. It had reached the national stage, attracted the attention of the highest political figures, and offered impressive prize money. Yet despite its expanding scale, it still remained within the framework of competitive tradition, not yet an industry, but clearly moving toward something larger. Entering the 18th century, wrestling in the British Isles began to show significant changes. If in previous centuries it had lived primarily as a social tradition and a marker of local identity, now efforts toward documentation and structured organization began to emerge. In Devon, in 1708, Charles Vancouver wrote a detailed description of Devonshire wrestling explaining techniques, prize money ranging from 6 to 10 guineas, the use of hard shoes, the structure of tournaments, and the role of sticklers, officials responsible for maintaining order during matches. In Cornwall, in 1713, Sir Thomas Parkins published the In Play, a wrestling manual that was reprinted multiple times. For the first time, techniques were not only passed down orally, but formally codified in written text. A more significant step occurred in 1752 with the formation of the Cornwall and Devon Wrestling Society. This organization even staged tournaments in London, often in the area of Hackney Wick. This meant that a wrestling tradition rooted in southwest England was now appearing in the capital before a far more diverse audience. It was no longer purely regional. In Ireland, during the same century, the grips used in brolidheach began to standardize. The right hand placed on the collar and the left hand on the elbow became the dominant form, a style that later became known in English as collar and elbow. All of these developments point to a clear pattern. The 18th century was the period when wrestling began to move from local tradition toward a more organized form. It was not yet an industry, but it already possessed structure, clearer rules, organizations, and even cross-regional reach. In Cumberland and Westmoreland, Backhold wrestling continued to develop throughout the 18th century, but like many folk sports that began attracting wider public attention, popularity also brought problems. One well-known practice at the time was called barneying. This referred to secretly arranged matches, in which two wrestlers agreed beforehand to split the prize money without seriously competing. Attempts to ban the practice had already appeared in the early 1700s. Yet in reality, barneying continued. Spectator gambling only made matters worse. When match results were seen as suspicious, disturbances frequently broke out among the crowd. Strong local loyalties, combined with money at stake, made the atmosphere highly volatile. Organizers attempted to restore order by introducing stricter rules and excluding wrestlers suspected of dishonesty. But as long as wrestling remained embedded in folk tradition, full control was difficult to enforce. At the same time, however, Cumberland and Westmoreland wrestling was rising in prominence. From around the 1770s onward, Matches were no longer simply ordinary village entertainment. Prize money began to be offered, and local championship titles became symbols of social prestige. At first, the prizes were modest, a leather belt, deerskin breeches, or other practical goods. But as attendance and wagering increased, the value of the prizes grew as well. This rapid rise in popularity shows that wrestling in northern England was moving toward a more competitive and economically open form, while still remaining within the framework of community tradition. By the latter half of the 18th century, a significant shift became visible. Where wrestling had once been known mainly as a community custom, individual figures now began to emerge whose reputations extended beyond their home villages. The era of the local champion had begun. In Cornwall around 1772 or 1774, the exact record isn't entirely clear, a man named Richard Parkin was born. He grew up in a place known as Parkin's Shop, and would later become one of the most respected champions of Cornish wrestling. His nickname was simple but powerful, the Great Parkin. Historical records about his life are limited, but descriptions of his physique often stand out. He was said to stand around 6 feet tall, weigh over 230 pounds, and possess extraordinary strength. Parkin was not the only respected wrestler of his era. In Cornwall, another formidable figure was Richard Jolly of St. Column. Across the border in Devon, powerful competitors were also emerging, most notably John Jordan, known as Giant Jordan, along with other tough wrestlers such as William Refford. It was among these men that the intense rivalry between Cornwall and Devon grew even stronger. One of the most famous events of that era was the Saltash match. The story began with a newspaper report claiming that the Devon wrestler Jordan had defeated 15 of Cornwall's best wrestlers. For the people of Cornwall, this was more than a sporting claim. It was seen as an attack on their regional pride. So a prestigious challenge match was organized in Saltash, Cornwall. 2 Devon wrestlers, Jordan and Wadling, faced 2 Cornish champions, Parkin and Jolly of St. Column. The result shocked many. Jordan and Wadling were thrown in less than 2 minutes. There was no dispute about the outcome. Cornwall's victory was accepted outright. First and second prizes went to Parkin and Jolly, while the third prize was claimed by another Cornish wrestler. But what mattered even more than the result was what happened afterward. Cornish nobles immediately issued a new challenge: 10 Cornish wrestlers against 10 Devon wrestlers, with wagers ranging from 100 to 1,000 pounds. At this point, this was no longer just a sporting contest. It had become a matter of regional honor. Newspapers fueled the rivalry. Large wagers heightened the tension, and the reputation of entire regions was placed on the line inside the ring. The rivalry between Giant Jordan and the Great Parkin was itself legendary. Different accounts suggest that both men defeated each other at various times. This shows that dominance in wrestling during this era was rarely absolute. Looking at the broader historical record, from the 15th century onward, Cornwall and Devon had produced many notable wrestlers. Some were famous for their technique, others for their physical power, and some for their victories in major contests. But there is something particularly interesting about this period. The title of champion did not follow a clear system. Some wrestlers claimed the title themselves. Some were recognized by the public. Others gained the reputation through major tournament victories. There are even records of wrestlers being described as champions of Cornwall, Devon, or sometimes even England. But before the existence of formal governing organizations, there was no standardized championship system. In the end, only one thing truly mattered: reputation in the ring. In the next generation, in 1788, James Polkinghorne was born in St. Keverne, Cornwall. He later settled in St. Column Major and managed the Red Lion pub. Like Richard Parkin before him, he grew into a Cornish wrestling champion and eventually became a symbol of regional pride. Meanwhile, in northern England, Cumberland and Westmoreland also produced formidable figures. One of them was Adam Dodd of Langwathby Mill, widely known for his physical strength and his success in various local challenges, including victory at the Melmerby Rounds around 1788. Dodd's achievements helped popularize Backhold wrestling across northwest England. at a time when the sport was gaining broader recognition. In Devonshire, in 1794, Abraham Cann was born, the son of a farmer and wrestler, Robert Cann. Raised at Eastcombe Head Farm, Cann grew into a Devonshire wrestling champion and would later play a major role in the Devon-Cornwall rivalry of the early 19th century. By the end of the 18th century, wrestling in the British Isles was no longer merely a village tradition. It had produced names recognized across regions, rivalries amplified by the press, and matches filled with heavy wagering. The era of the regional champion had begun, yet this growing popularity was not welcomed by everyone. By the late 18th century, complaints were recorded from clergy in regions such as Devon, criticizing the habit of men spending their time at feasts, wrestling matches, and drinking. For some religious figures, wrestling was viewed as part of a culture that was too rough and potentially disorderly. But this very criticism reveals something important. Wrestling had become significant enough to attract public moral scrutiny. It was popular enough to become a subject of debate, and that alone shows how deeply embedded it had become in social life. As the 19th century began, wrestling in the British Isles entered a period of clear acceleration. If in the previous century rules had begun to be written and organizations had started to form, now the scale of contests expanded, audiences grew larger, and prize money became increasingly significant. Cornish wrestlers in the early 1800s were widely renowned, some even traveled abroad, and Cornish techniques began to be recognized by early American wrestlers. This meant their influence was already extending beyond England. In Devon, signs of commercialization began to appear. On the 3rd of July, 1806, an advertisement in the Exeter Flying Post promoted a Devonshire wrestling match alongside single-stick contests, another traditional West Country martial art. This shows that wrestling had become a publicly promoted spectacle. The year 1809 marked an important turning point in several regions. In Falmouth, Richard Parkin defeated Stiffy of St. Just in a widely recognized contest. In the North, that same year, the Carlisle and Cumberland Wrestling Association was established, one of the early predecessors of modern governing bodies. Efforts began to standardize the backhold grip as well as the ethics of competition. Entering the 1810 until 1830 period, Devon moved into what is often referred to as its golden age. Matches were capable of attracting thousands of spectators, and prize money sometimes exceeded the annual wages of skilled workers. In Cornwall, a tournament in Bodmin in 1811 drew around 4,000 spectators. In Cumberland, a major contest in Carlisle that same year offered a £20 prize, a substantial sum for a rural setting. In 1812, James Scott of Canonby, Scotland, won the main prize at the Carlisle tournament with a decisive backheel throw. This victory confirmed the effectiveness of backhold technique and demonstrated that skill was increasingly valued over mere brute strength. However, not every aspect of this growth was smooth. In Devon, for example, a wrestler named Nicholas John, who died around 1813, was known for showing his legs covered in scars, the result of kicks sustained during matches. This is a reminder that some styles remained harsh and physically risky. In Cumberland, the 19th century revival drew thousands of spectators to events such as the Grand Match of 1813, yet a prize-sharing controversy in 1815 revealed that dishonest practices had not entirely disappeared. Even so, prizes such as the Langwathby Prize of 2 guineas in 1816 demonstrated increasingly visible commercialization. In Cornwall, 1816 saw James Polkinghorne face Devon wrestlers like Flower and Jackman, intensifying cross-regional rivalry. By the 1820s, public house owners began actively promoting tournaments, recognizing wrestling as an effective way to attract customers. Cash prizes became more desirable than lace hats or silver objects, which had been common in earlier centuries. Wrestling was moving closer to direct cash exchange and the circulation of local economies. In Devon, Abraham Cann dominated competitions throughout the 1820s, and tournament prizes could reach £100 a figure that reflected a much larger commercial scale. In Cumberland, figures such as Abraham Brown, a clergyman, as well as a scholar, helped elevate wrestling's image from merely working-class entertainment to an activity respected by educated circles. But in Lancashire, the trajectory was different. The style known as up-and-down fighting, or purring, remained rough and brutal. By the 1820s, the practice was even declared illegal because it frequently caused serious injuries and deaths. This contrast is important. While some regions were moving toward structure and legitimacy, Lancashire faced crisis due to excessive violence. By the mid-19th century, wrestling in England was no longer merely a village pastime. It had become a large-scale spectacle with organizations, heavy wagering, substantial prize money, and widely recognized figures. Yet each region followed a different path. Some became more regulated, some became increasingly commercial, and others were forced to adapt under legal and social pressure. Entering the 1820s, wrestling in the British Isles entered a truly explosive phase. In Scotland, 1822 became a symbolic turning point. The Inverness Northern Meeting featured wrestling within the increasingly structured framework of the Highland Games. At the same time, a wave of Highland romanticism was taking place. Literature and the revival of Scottish identity brought renewed appreciation to traditional sports. Backhold was no longer simply a village custom, it was positioned as a symbol of Highland strength. Meanwhile, in Devon, the scale expanded dramatically. In 1824, between 6,000 and 7,000 spectators attended a major contest at the White Hart Inn in Okehampton. One of the matches reportedly lasted nearly 2 hours, approximately 1 hour and 56 minutes. The following year, in 1825, Abraham Can faced James Stone, nicknamed Little Elephant. The match lasted around 70 minutes and became a milestone in Can's growing reputation. Yet in the same year, he also suffered a relatively quick defeat of about 33 minutes, and rumors spread that he had been bewitched. This shows how significant a wrestler's reputation had become. It had grown large enough that mystical narratives began to surround the competition itself. The peak came on the 23rd of October, 1826. James Polkinghorne of Cornwall faced Abraham Can of Devon. Champion of Cornwall versus champion of Devon. It is estimated that between 17,000 and 20,000 spectators were present. The result was disputed and often regarded as a draw. The Cornish side accused Can of unfair tactics for using kicks and thick shoes legal under Devon rules, but unacceptable within Cornish tradition. This match was not merely about technique, it was about conflicting regional rule systems. It was about territorial honor, and was about how tens of thousands of people were willing to gather to witness a duel between two celebrated names. In 1827, Can competed in London with a top prize of £100, a figure that clearly reflected the expanding commercial scale. In one of his matches against Gaffney, the roof of a warehouse where spectators were standing collapsed, causing numerous minor injuries. Yet the contest was widely remembered and covered by the sporting press. The following year, in 1828, at Hay Park near Leeds, the total prize fund reached £75, with estimated event expenses exceeding £500. This was no longer a village contest. It was a regional spectacle with a real economic structure behind it. However, not every region experienced consistent growth. While Devon, Cornwall, and Northern England entered a phase of exploding attendance and rising prize money, Ireland followed a different path. The collar and elbow style did not experience sustained expansion during this period. It remained alive as a tradition, but it did not develop into a continuous circuit of major tournaments as seen in England. There is one moment often remembered. In 1826, in Kildare, a match between Larkin and Carey became an extraordinary event for its time. Nearly 10,000 people were reported to have gathered around the field, an enormous number for a folk wrestling contest. The bout was held in a wide-open space. The arena formed a massive circle, and 5 mounted horsemen were stationed to control the crowd. In terms of scale, this was a major event. But unlike in Devon or Cornwall, this surge of attention was not followed by a sustained tournament system or stable organizational growth. It is remembered more as a brief peak, a sudden explosion of public interest that did not fully develop into a long-term movement in its own homeland. On the other hand, Lancashire followed a different path. After the brutal practice of up-and-down fighting was declared illegal in the 1820s, the style began to adapt. Rules were adjusted. Ground wrestling was retained, but the most dangerous techniques were gradually reduced. Matches continued to take place in pub yards and mining districts. The stakes were modest hat collection from spectators, a pig or a silver watch. Its base was the working-class textile workers and coal miners. The toughest wrestlers earned the nickname Black Diamonds. The atmosphere was rough, direct, and full of raw emotion. One of the earliest major contests on record took place between two Lancashire towns, Bolton and Oldham. The meeting later became known as the Lancashire Catch Wrestling Derby. Names such as John Rowland, William Buckley, and John Holt emerged as some of the toughest figures of the era. From this environment, Lancashire wrestling began to shape its identity rougher, freer, and gradually becoming known as professional Lancashire catch as catch-can wrestling. Meanwhile, major changes were also taking place outside the arena. After the Industrial Revolution, mass migration from Britain increased dramatically. Steamship technology accelerated transatlantic travel. America began filling with immigrant communities who carried their wrestling traditions with them. Not only America, Australia, and New Zealand also became migration destinations, and with those migrants, wrestling crossed the ocean. At this point, wrestling was no longer merely a regional English phenomenon. It had become a tradition moving across continents.